Hi, my name is Alex Hayward, and I'm currently a junior at Montana State, pursuing a political science major and a history minor. Throughout the semester in this class, I have focused my attention on analyzing red flag legislation in different states. For those of you who aren't familiar with red flag laws, the general definition is that red flag laws allow courts to prevent people who show signs of being a danger to themselves or others from having access to firearms through ordering the seizure of one's weapons. I decided to reach out to policymakers from my home state, Alaska, regarding their House Bill 62, which was introduced in the 2019 to 2020 legislative session, but ultimately failed in May of last year. I was fortunate enough to meet with two Alaska representatives to discuss this bill. My first interview was with Representative Fields. Rep. Fields was a co-sponsor for House Bill 62, and I'm going to include just a few snippets from my interview with him that not only reflect Alaska's attitude toward gun control laws, but also what being a co-sponsor of a bill really means.
There are a lot of proposals out there to deal with gun violence, but ranking them in terms of order of efficacy versus likelihood of passage. In a state where people absolutely rely on hunting to put food on the table, I don't know, because I do support people's right to use guns.
Yeah.
And for self-defense. So anytime you're dealing with an issue like gun control, I think it's it's tricky to find that balance. Session, I don't recall all of the details, but I believe there were constituents who expressed an interest in me co-sponsoring this bill, and I think that's why I looked at it and co-sponsored it.
Yeah.
A lot of the time a constituent asks, or you just see a bill and agree with it and you co-sponsor, and that's kind of, to be honest, that's the level of analysis I think for most of us to co-sponsor a bill. Okay. Do I agree with it? Maybe. Do I agree with it and someone asked me to do it, who's a constituent and you want to support your constituents?
Yeah. Okay, well, that makes sense.
Not super complicated. I didn't write the bill, so would defer to Representative Tarr in terms of her intent.
So that's what I did. I reached out to the primary sponsor, Representative Tarr, and she was able to provide a more comprehensive response regarding House Bill 62's purpose. Although the interview went well over the time limit of 10 minutes, I've included the important components that I feel are most relevant for this class.
So one is that we lead the nation in suicide deaths. We're always at the top of the list for just the number of suicides per capita. We struggle with that. And then we have community level violence. We've had young people that were innocent bystanders get killed.
Yeah.
So those folks are losing their life to community gun violence. And then we also, unfortunately, we have our really high rates of domestic violence and sexual assault.
Yeah.
We have often been at the top of the list for women killed by men. Really, whether it's self-harm or community-level violence or interpersonal violence, there's a lot of gun violence impacting a lot of Alaskans. So what's the problem I'm trying to address? Well, we have a lot of people who own guns.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not so concerned about most of those people, and you probably aren't either.
Yeah.
We're concerned about a very small percentage of all the people who either own guns or have access to guns. And in that small percentage, then we can divide those up into people who would harm themselves and then people who are harming others. I like this policy alternative because it can address both of those, both self-harm prevention and community harm and interpersonal harm prevention. And then also this particular policy is temporary in nature. This extreme risk protection order really narrows in on the few people that we're concerned about. It can help both prevent self-harm as well as community-level harm. And that's been backed up by research now that has shown that this policy can prevent and reduce suicides as well as mass shootings and school shootings. So it gets at all of that, and then it's temporary so that it accomplishes what it needs to during that time period. But one thing that would come up when we started working on this bill was people would say, well, if someone's dangerous, why don't we just, lock them up and put them away?
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, okay, let's think about this. When you, involuntarily commit someone or put them away, you have taken away all of their rights.
Yeah.
That's a really extreme measure. What we're talking about is temporarily restricting just one of their rights. It's really hard because what happens is that the positions get pretty polarized.
Mm.
And then what happens is people start to feel like it's the slippery slope. But when I think about my role as a policymaker, I am not interested in putting time into passing measures that really don't solve problems. I support background checks because background checks are a preventative measure.
Exactly, yeah.
In the way, right? Just in the same way this one is, you're saying, okay, let's prevent the harm from happening by, weeding out that small number of people that we have to be concerned about. And so when we put the first bill together, when you have that kind of context that you're operating in, you know that due process is something that's going to come up as a concern.
Yeah.
And so we made sure to have due process in our bill. In our bill, there are three types of orders. There's an emergency, a short-term, and a long-term.
Yeah.
So when I first introduced my bill, the NRA was neutral on it. And that felt pretty successful because, again, that if they come out and oppose it, that's where you're going to have a problem. So we were kind of operating in this neutral category. Well, Representative Clayman is the chair of the Judiciary Committee where the bill was.
Yeah.
He had this idea that he should make the bill look more like Indiana because, he would be able to convince our Republican colleagues. Well, he did put in the bill that looks more like the Indiana bill. Unfortunately, the Indiana bill, and I mentioned a moment ago, came about because of an officer-involved shooting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Indiana bill has warrantless seizure.
Okay.
And the NRA really, really opposes that.
Yeah.
So what happened was the NRA that had been neutral on my bill then came out in strong opposition of this new version of my bill.
Okay.
And then the Republicans on the committee all decided to oppose the bill, and that was the end of it. I did put in another version this year. It's House Bill 122.
Okay.
And I'm going to keep trying. Another reason that I'm going to continue to put this bill in is that I'm not going to wait until there's a shooting in Alaska. That's what I'm not going to wait for.
Yeah, I feel like that would go against the very nature of the bill if you just waited for something bad to happen,
Yeah, exactly, right?
Yeah.
Good point. Very good point.
So I just want to give a huge thank you to both Representative Fields and Representative Tarr. These interviews really opened my eyes to the politics that passing a bill entails. Considering that the NRA, which is definitely a Republican stakeholder group regarding gun control legislation, was neutral toward Rep. Tarr's extreme risk protection order bills initially, I believe that red flag legislation can be possible in states like Alaska and Montana, who predominantly have a pro-gun culture. The main concern is ensuring that there is no infringement on due process, including the warrantless seizures that were deemed permissible in Indiana. So the two remedies that I would suggest that seem to work in other states like Washington and Colorado is one, providing sufficient due process, which includes limiting the group who have the authority to file petitions in the first place, like law enforcement, family members, and members of the household, outlining penalties for false reports, either a gross misdemeanor or a penalty of perjury, and the respondent should be allowed to cross-examine the petitioner at the trial where the accused has the chance to challenge the allegations being brought against them. The second remedy would be avoiding any phrases of ambiguity. Terms like legitimate threat or mental crisis need to be fully outlined in the bill. Red flag legislation frames the issue of gun violence in mental health terms, which is a much more proactive gun control measure. If drafted meticulously, I truly think that red flag laws have the ability to be adopted nationwide, potentially eliminating a lot of the gun violence that plagues our nation. Thank you.